And here we are. Am I correct in saying this is episode 23?
I think that's correct. We never get this right, folks. Yeah, we should be on episode 23. Let me take a look here.
Yes.
Um,
We talked about a few things before starting and didn't discuss that. So there you go.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep, that's right, 23. Yeah.
Cool. Oh, there we are. So the big news this week, I just stumbled across this a few days ago. It was quite funny, and I don't know why I was quite looking at the Southern Poverty Law Centre website, but for some reason I was,
Mm-hmm.
and I discovered. So give you a bit of background before the big reveal. A voice for men. It's often been stated for a long time that the Voice for Men was listed as a hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Centre. Notably, that came up as a topic in the Red Pill documentary, and Cassie J actually called the Southern Poverty Law Centre, and they confirmed that a Voice for Men was not, I repeat, not listed as a hate group. Well, in 2018, they were. A Voice for Men was listed as a hate group. And I actually emailed Cassie J. I don't know if I was the only one who did, but she actually called them and they confirmed it over the phone to her. And she was really quite shocked about that, I think, especially given that in the past they had said AVFM was not.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was 2018. 2022 rolls around and they quietly removed A Voice for Men as a hate group. And I'll get to the reason why in a moment, but they added XY Crew. Now, they did this as one action, if you like. So they removed A Voice for Men and immediately added XY Crew. For those who don't know, XY Crew is an organisation that was started by Paul Elam a couple of years ago, and Janice Fiamengo as well. I think I don't think Tom Golden was involved in that, actually. He was involved in some other stuff regarding men, but I don't think he was involved in XY Crew. Anyway, it's just really a discussion group for men. The groups, the facilitators may be male or female. So Janice has a group, but the participants in the groups are always just men. And it's really, I've attended meetings as well. I'm not a regular attendee in XY crew meetings, but I have attended meetings. And it's really just sometimes just shooting the breeze, just guys chatting about things they want to talk about. If they've got a problem, they're welcome to do that. What it's not recorded and what's said in the meeting stays in the meeting. So it's absolutely stunning. I mean, the Southern Poverty Law Centre made some claims about A Voice for Men. I dispute that. Others involved with AVFM dispute their claims and so forth. But they at least put down reasons why AVFM was classified as a hate group. XY Crew, given the nature of the organisation, given the nature of what's going on there, I really am at a complete loss to understand what their possible justification would. Even if the AVFM justification was weak, I think their justification for XY Crew has to be zero. What possible reason could they have for listing XY Crew?
Exactly. They have less of a case than before, and they didn't have much of a case during AVFM when they had them on the list. But right now, exactly. It's just because it's Paul Elam, isn't it?
Well, it really does seem that way because I'll tell you the reason why. And I'm going to read from the Southern Poverty Law Centre website right now, and I've taken an archive copy of this, so if they go and change it. Now, bear in mind, this was 2022, and I actually contacted Paul. Paul hadn't wasn't aware of it either. It was just something they very quietly done. I suspected for a while that this might have been an excuse, that they realised that putting AVFM on the list was a mistake, and that this gave them an excuse to remove it. But that doesn't explain why XY Crew was then added on the list. So it kind of does, to me, seem like they're going after Paul. Anyway, Paul. Anyway, here we are. I'm now quoting from the Southern Poverty Law Centre website. The number of male supremacist groups remained stagnant in 2022. A Voice for Men is no longer listed as an active hate group in the United States because it is now operated out of Australia by Robert Brockway. However, a new group, XY Crew, was added. Paul Elam announced the creation of this new men's rights activist group in January 2022, while he explained his departure from Voice for Men. End quote. So that's the reason. So the reason they have removed Voice for Men from the hate group list is because I run it now. Thanks very much, Southern Poverty Law Centre. That's a fabulous reason. Let me be very, very clear that we have as much interest in the United States and activities going on there and issues facing men in the United States as we always did at A Voice for Men. That hasn't changed one iota because I happen to live in Australia. As I said, I think this almost smacks of being some sort of excuse to get it off the list, but there we are. I just wanted to quickly note that I think the wording subtly changed. It says A Voice for Men is no longer listed as an active hate group in the United States because it is now operated out of Australia by Robert Brockway. Now, I notice that none of the previous references to this that I read, and I went back and looked at the original 2018 reference, they don't mention it being a group in the United States. It just talks about accusing it of being a hate group. If they use the same standard they used before, it should presumably still be on the list. So I think there's been a subtle change in wording there, and it comes across as an excuse to get it off the list. But as I said, that doesn't explain why XY Crew is now on the list, despite there being even less reason for it to be there.
Right. Yeah. You're not doing your job. We're not too much of a hate group anymore because of you. Yeah. What kind of a leader are you? Come on. Yeah.
I tell you what, exactly. So, the Southern Poverty Law Centre has been around since the 1970s, I think. There's an argument that they did do some good stuff originally. They took on the KKK and so forth. But in the last few years, I've read a bit about them, and there seem to have been concerns about the organisation as far back as the 1980s, where people expressed concerns about the direction they were taking. I think that there's definitely a problem now. And I do recall, actually, I did see one video about them, actually, that I posted on A Voice for Men. That was probably the reason, actually, that I went and looked on their website, actually, because I saw somebody criticising the Southern Poverty Law Centre, and I posted on A Voice for Men. Their criticisms were principally around the use of their money, so use of their assets. So they've got quite a considerable amount of money behind them. I think about $100 million US, or maybe more than that. And apparently, some of the money is kept in the Cayman Islands, according to some sources that I've read and seen. So there's some questions about the money they have, what they're doing with that money, and so forth. The issues mentioned raised in the video I saw didn't talk about the issues that we're talking about, but I do think there's a number of problems with the Southern Poverty Law Centre. And apparently, Apple donated a considerable sum of money. I've heard between $1 and $2 million US to them that was in 2017. So we're still seeing large donations from corporate America, unfortunately. Imagine what we could do with $1 billion US. So that's the Southern Poverty Law Centre, for those who haven't heard of it. The Voice for Men is no longer on the list. So thanks to that, which I only discovered a few days ago, I'm going to apply to Facebook to have the Facebook ban lifted. And also to the Twitter account for A Voice for Men is actually being banned, and we're going to include that in the submission to have it unbanned as well.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah. So there we are. And yes, I'd love to. I mean, I'm not involved with XY Crew at all, other than being the occasional participant, but I would love to hear from Southern Poverty Law Centre about what their possible justification for having it listed as a hate group. And the question is, too, did they mean a hate group or a hate group active in the United States? Because, as I said, that seems to be a subtle change in the wording, which has occurred recently.
Yeah.
So there we are. I've got a couple of other items. It sort of relates to this a little bit too, actually, that
sure.
I've noticed, we have talked about this before, cultural zeitgeist, probably a bit of a cliche term, it gets used at times, but there's definitely change in Western civilization. We've seen a lot of work coming in over the last few years, but there is growing pushback, I think. I think we're seeing men being treated better in movies and TV than we have in the past. I think that possibly peaked sometime even in the 90s, early 2000s, where it was quite horrible. But I do believe we're seeing, just men being treated a little bit better, less stupidity, because we've seen a lot of men and women talking about this and pushing back on this. Not so much in the news media, though. I think the news media is very feminist and very woke and will be slow to change. certainly in the last 10 years that I've been particularly watching these things, I'm quite certain I've seen a change. And the second point, and this is something I've seen in the last 10 years, there's definitely been a huge amount of change in the way feminists are online. 10 years ago, when I first got involved, we were ending up in regular online arguments with them. It was actually kind of fun in many ways. And I got to know a lot of people, such as, I'm sure you won't mind me mentioning, Jack Barnes is someone I've known for a long time. He's American, and I'd often see him in the comments, and I'd see actually there were some feminists that I saw regularly as well. So this would go on from on one side, we'd argue for a few days, and then go on to another side. Nothing like that's happening anymore, and we're still posting, in fact, more than ever. But I think they really don't argue with us. I think that they seem tired, and the wind's gone out of their sails. And of course, there's the whole problem with the trans movement breaking and fracturing feminism in two. I think that's been probably a body blow for feminism. So there's huge problems there within feminism. Of course, with the anti-trans group that were previously called themselves feminists are now calling themselves women's rights activists, as we mentioned. But I do think that we're seeing a huge change there, and related to that is something that we've been talking about a lot of years: men checking out. In fact, I haven't watched Paul's interview with Pearl Davis, but I believe that's a major point, a major key discussion point there. And this is something that I'm seeing a lot, particularly a lot of young women talking about online now. I think this has been growing for a couple of years, but particularly in the last few weeks, it seems to me that YouTube seems to be almost full of these of videos of young women talking about this problem.
Right. Well, men checking out basically is in essence men being independent. They're discovering their independence. And imagine that, classifying that as a problem. When women talk about this, men being independent is a problem to them.
Quite right. Quite right. And I did phrase it that way.
I don't have any sympathy at all for these women, because they are trying to undermine men's independence. But this is what America, at the very least, is all about: men's independence, really. Because
go ahead. This problem's been developing for decades, and I think it's going to take a long time to fix. I suspect many of the young women who are now getting concerned about it believe there may be a quick fix, but I think we're past the quick fix, unfortunately for them, and to a certain extent, unfortunately for society. See, I can say, oh, this is going to be a problem for society, while simultaneously saying I can absolutely understand why these men are doing it, and I'm glad that they're not buying into the gynocentrism of the past. But society's going to have to adjust.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'd even say this is going to be good for society, because men are going to have have better standards for themselves. They're going to have a better image about themselves. They'll have better goals, and not towards gynocentric ends anymore. Because I don't think gynocentrism is good for society one bit.
No, I agree. I just mean that in the short term, I think there's going to be pain. So, but we'll get there. Yeah. So, but yes, I agree. In the medium to long term, I think this will be better, and certainly, and this is a key point we make it a voice for men. It's about men living for themselves and not just sacrificing for society mindlessly, not society expecting them or forcing them to sacrifice themselves. Which is why I support the all able-bodied adults. If there must be a draft in society, all able-bodied adults should be drafted on the same terms.
Say more on that.
Oh, so basically, almost every country drafts men. As we know, there are a few countries that draft women, but it's still not, with the possible exception of Eritrea, it's not on the same terms as men. But my argument is that if a society must have a draft, and the society believes they must defend themselves against an external threat, that all able-bodied adults should equally bear the responsibility for that. And of course, it's not the case. Only minority of military roles are combat roles. So whether or not women should be in combat, I think, is a separate argument. And I don't feel qualified to make a determination on that. I've heard arguments both ways. Probably I would lean towards having them in combat just by virtue of it being an equal society. But again, I recognise that I don't have the background to really speak about that. But in terms of the draft, in terms of having women in the military, I think it has to be on equal terms.
Equal terms, yeah, I understand that.
Yeah. I don't know if I spoke about this previously, but I did some research into Israel a while back. Israel, we have spoken about this, but I think I've learned a little bit more since the last time we spoke. Israel does draft women, as is widely known, but it doesn't draft them on the same basis as men. Women serve a shorter default period. Women cannot be forced into a combat, but they can choose to go into combat, whereas men can be drafted and forced into combat. If women elect to go into a combat role, they must serve a longer period of enlistment, mandatory enlistment, the same period that men must, because their training is more expensive. Some years ago, I did a bit of research and found that when women were put into combat roles, they were put into a relatively small number of units, and that these were not frontline infantry units; they were border protection units, which, while they may end up in combat, are less likely than ending up in combat. Since then, I've actually spoken to an Israeli who was talking about this online, and he made a really interesting post about it, and even named some of the units that the women go into, and confirmed what I had long suspected, which is that these units are deliberately kept back from. And he also noted, I don't know if this is true or not, but this gentleman noted that some underperforming men were put into the same units. And he said that the men in those units still tended to perform better than the women in terms of the various exercises, such as distance running and so forth. But he said it was generally not up to the same standard as the men in the frontline combat units. So essentially, these units the women would go in, and some men who were not cutting it in the other units would also end up in those units, according to this claim, and that these units would then be put in secondary roles. So,
right.
Anyway, that's consistent with what I have previously learned on the topic. I can't speak to the veracity of those claims, and this is an Israeli who claimed to have gone through the system and was talking about it from personal knowledge.
Exactly. Well, it seems like the entire purpose that women get, enlisted in these things at all is for the image, really. We include women too on this one, but of course they don't do anything substantial. Which
it's interesting. In terms of combat roles, I think it's certainly endurance and so forth. And it's not just about. I mean, a lot is made of muscle mass, particularly upper body muscle mass, but there's various other differences. One of the most interesting, I think, is that men are more pound for pound. Men do more efficient energy conversion. So, oxygen conversion for blood, I should say. So, if a man and a woman had the same amount of blood, for example, the men would still be more efficient in terms of extracting oxygen from the blood. And I find that really interesting, actually. Right. There are a number of other differences too, like joints. I've read joints are different, and male joints can take more punishment and so forth. Mm-hmm. So there are a number of physical differences that certainly affect output in a situation like that.
Exactly. But in the best context of combat, because when I think about proper kind of defending your country attitudes, I'm kind of falling back in my mind to like the grassroots way that we do this thing, like how the original the Americans intended for this sort of thing to be, I suppose. Like, just, personally being armed and prepared to defend your home, that kind of thing.
And with the militias, for example, you're saying, where they would form militias in the community.
Exactly. And more to the point, so we talk about all these differences in in physicality when it comes to combat, but women can operate a gun just fine. So I think that the differences are becoming unimportant at this point, because the technology is getting better and better for these sort of combat. So I don't think they have much excuse anymore. They just I think they're just afraid that they're going to whine that they're being given too much work.
And there are also areas like armor, tanks, for example, where presumably the physical differences wouldn't matter as much. Although I actually saw a documentary once on a tank, American tank being fired, and they were actually manually loading the weapon inside, and that seemed to be fairly strenuous. But there were plenty of other roles, presumably, which would not be as strenuous within the tank. So, yeah, those are still combat roles. And Yeah, I don't actually. In the case of Israel, I'm not sure if women are allowed in tanks or not. I know they are allowed. They now are allowed in fighter jets now, but there's only a relatively small number. And I think the first woman who tried actually failed the course. She took it to the High Court in Israel and then got passed and I think failed the course. But since then, a few women have got through.
Right. Yeah. And more to the point, I was talking about how this is more about women's image and such. So, do you know a lot about how? So, when you see some kind of footage about North Korea's military, you tend to see a lot of North Korean women marching on the streets and such, right? Well, as it turns out, that's like the only purpose of the women in those militaries, as far as I can tell. It's just to kind of show off that we have women in the military, but that they have women in their military, but they don't. That's really it. It's just for show, as far as I understand it.
Yeah, probably see something similar with the Soviet Union too. I mean, communist countries have tended to focus on, not always, but focus on reducing outward gender differences in a lot of cases, and they're probably more willing to have women in the military early on. It is true that there were female snipers in World War II in the Soviet military, and some of them were quite effective, but there were also a lot of men who were very effective, of course. I don't know what proportion of snipers were women. I do know there were some, but yeah, it's something you do see in communist countries to a large extent, to the extent that North Korea is still a communist country versus what Juche, I think you said it's pronounced.
Yeah. I don't think there's any important difference between it.
Okay, fair enough, because I thought it may have diverged from communism somewhat since then, but okay, fair enough. Yeah, it's interesting. I think communist countries to a large were probably early in adopting women into the military in that regard, and of course the Soviet Union was probably so desperate that they were adopting everyone. But nevertheless, the high mortality rates were generally seen among men, which indicates they were far more likely to be in combat. So, yeah, as I said, it's an interesting one to discuss, women in combat. But the point I want to always emphasize is it's a different argument to women in the military. A lot of the time when I see anti-women's draft arguments, they're mostly anti-combat arguments. And the key point the key takeaway for me is merely deciding not to have women in combat would not be sufficient not to have women in the military, because there are plenty of military roles which are not combat roles.
Yeah, yes, I get what you're saying, because it's a very gynocentric argument that.
And that's what we've seen out of the US with the of course, selective service itself is not a draft. It is a list of people who could be used as a basis of a draft, and yet many of the arguments I've seen have been anti-combat arguments. That alone should not keep women out of selective service.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the anti-combat arguments are something that they kind of fall into when they're being defensive. When we can confront them that they're being just think about the women or something like that. They don't deserve to be there. So of course, when they're their backs to the wall, they're being caught saying that only men should be disposable. That's
right. And that's true. They are effectively saying exactly, and they really are. Yeah. So as I said, they're not effective arguments against the draft itself, but you're absolutely right. They are. Yeah, they're very much arguments in which they're displaying gynocentrism and willingness to for male disposability very plainly. But yeah, there it is. Unfortunately, and the US still doesn't have women in selective service. I note the National Organization for Women opposes selective service, but I think their principal reason for that is because they're genuinely afraid that women will end up on the list.
Exactly.
Yes, and a legitimate way to argue against that, of course, is to abolish it entirely.
Right, yeah. It's kind of sad, nobody really talks about actually being anti-war, actually preventing war, they're always, they're speaking of war as if it's something that is morally correct or something like that. I don't know, I'm pretty anti-war, so I'm pretty biased, but
Yeah, yeah. As I think, I don't know if I've said before, but my position is always to try to minimize harm, human suffering, essentially. And there've been one or two situations where it seems like a short war might have been better than a longer period of non-war. The one that I come to think of is the sanctions against Iraq, which lasted about 20 years, and the projections suggest that the number of people who died during the sanctions was significantly greater than the number of people who died in the war. To the extent that any of it had to happen, perhaps a shorter war ending it quickly might have been better than sanctions dragging on for 20 years. But yeah, basically, I've probably modified my position a little bit since seeing that, going from anti-war to minimizing human suffering. And then, of course, you get the question about a just war against, say, the Nazis. I mean, should you allow Poland to be conquered by the Nazis, or go to war over that? So
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I think World War II was probably the last very painful war, and by this I mean, what I mean is, ever since then, war has become more painless, not to its combatants, but to the general public. We're
Political.
right, yeah, it's more clinical. We kind of we have all these wars since, and we're barely aware of them.
That's true, actually.
Right.
That's true.
Like one thing, yeah. I was it was something that kind of came across. I was watching Pearl's interview with Janice, right, and I think the subject of war came up, and yeah, the subject was something along the lines of Pearl saying, about what if we went to war again or something like that, and it's talking about men's utility as such. I think that's how it was. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I just saw it. It's fresh but not ingrained in my mind. If that made any sense. But then Janice responded, well, we are in wars today, so so that's more to the point. We seem to be not completely, but somewhat unaware that wars have been happening this whole time. We've just been we've had it easy in the fact that it hasn't directly affected us, unless we probably had someone in the military that died or something like that. But it's otherwise just something that we take completely for granted. I think in terms of attention, I think the whole Russia-Ukraine war has gotten the most, and I'm pretty sure. Well, and ironically, there's not much call to stop the war. There's more about keeping it going.
Well, a war in Europe, I think a war in Europe, it's the first. I mean, there was obviously a war in the former Yugoslavia and so forth, but this is certainly the first major war that's happened in Europe. I was going to say, on your point about wars happening without it being kind of in our face, as it were. I think that's a really good point. And one particular area that I think of is rationing, actually. So World War II, even in faraway Australia, rationing occurred, and that's because Australia was directly threatened during part of the war, but the principal reason why rationing occurred here was because food was being sent primarily to the UK to feed it, right? So they rationed here. But rationing ended in Australia, I think, in something like 1948, whereas in the UK it continued right through to the mid-50s. So you've got the rationing going on for a longer period after the war than the actual war took, which I think shows how much it affected people's lives, even if they didn't have any immediate family members, and even if they weren't being attacked, it affected their lives greatly. Now, of course, as you say, we've had war. There was a 20-year conflict in Afghanistan and wars in Iraq and so forth. And there's nothing like rationing or anything. The government's not diverting any resources. The number of people directly involved is relatively small. I don't know if you know, but Australia's currently rearming. So it will be interesting to see it's not going to affect our day-to-day lives just yet, I don't think, but it is going to probably be more in our face here. So that the threat from China is being taken much more seriously now. The country is acquiring long-range missile technology. There's been a feeling for a long time. The country didn't need a very large military to protect itself, and there's a lot happening. The nuclear submarines with the AUKUS agreement, of course. So we might have nuclear submarines here even in a few years, because there may be, and I think they're already training. There's some plan possibly for Australia to take possession of some pre-existing submarines, and I think they're already training the crews. So in the US, so it's unfortunately the case that at least here it's going to be more visible, and I'm actually already seeing this. A number of people I know, for example, have recently taken up employment with defence contractors. So I think it is clear that there's the defence and military is going to be more prominent here, at least in the coming years.
Right. But yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that war was never regular in the past, right? Not regular historically, but it is more banal nowadays to the general public. And it's we just so it used to be that we had to be prepared for war and the implications thereof, but where it's no one's prepared for that kind of thing if it hits them. Otherwise we just kind of observe it from a distance in our armchairs.
And I mean, certainly if I get at the risk of talking about Australia a lot in this situation, that's something that's happened here too. There's been a great sense of safety here for a long time in terms of war always seems somewhere else. And I think a lot of people have become quite shocked to see the militarization of the region of Southeast Asia and East Asia, and the threats to countries like Japan, for example, and Taiwan. And these are countries that Australia is closely aligned to. And if Taiwan is attacked or Japan is attacked, there's a very good chance that Australian military assets will be involved defending those countries. So this is something that, people here are now starting to have to think about. And we've got a lot of people who and this is true in other Western countries too, who have lived through the safest, most prosperous period of human history. And we may not be able to take for granted that things are going to be as good in the future as they've been for the last few decades, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I don't remember if I talked about this on the show before, but every time I think about how convenient war is become, and so taken for granted, I think of a Star Trek episode called "A Taste of Armageddon." Yeah, did I already talk about this?
I think you may have mentioned it, but that's okay. Please go ahead. I actually thought of it too just then. Yes.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, because it's a Star Trek episode in which they visit a planet that's been at war with a different planet for hundreds and hundreds of years, because the entire war is done by computers, and practically in theory, except they don't use real bombs. They just use practically a simulation, and everybody that's in the area where the bomb destroys a part of the city or something, like hits the city, you have to report to the disintegration chambers. And their argument was the war continues, but the cultures go on. So there's no incentive to end the war.
In particular, no infrastructure is being destroyed. People are dying, but no infrastructure is being destroyed. Exactly.
Right.
That's right. And as I recall, they did have real weapons, but the real weapons the missiles sat in their silos as long as each side complied with the rules.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I think,
and then Kirk threatened to blow up the whole planet to get them, obviously it's to save themselves, which is fine. But it took that for them to knock it off.
Yeah, that's right. I think he forced them back into a real war, didn't he? Which would then make the cost of the entire war
right. Yeah.
visible.
Yeah. Well, in a sense, it got them to start got them to get serious about talking peace with the other side.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the hope that they will then talk peace. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. But
I guess go on.
No. That's that episode keeps on sticking in my mind in these when the subject of war comes around. You know, like as much as we talk about how war is more technologically convenient, you know, I worry that's the direction we're going. And I think the deaths of people are going to be that much more as banal as we're taking war today. And I don't like where that's going, you know?
Yeah, it's interesting, we see more drone attacks happening too. That's right. You may, as you say, may just become more and more abstract, which may, as the episode suggested, lessen the impetus to come to any sort of peaceful resolution.
Exactly.
Instead of consuming resources, which is what ultimately war does. Speaking of which, 1984. Don't know, have you read it, Vernon?
I read 1984 back in school.
Okay, great. Yeah. Because that's of course a key point. For those who don't know, 1984. A bit of a spoiler. It's been around since the book's been around since 1948, so it's probably okay to mention. There are, according to the backstory, which may or may not be true, because you can never be sure of anything in 1984. But as far as we know, there are 3 superstates that not only are incapable of defeating each other, but have no interest in doing so. Instead, there's a constant war between them, usually in a 2-to-1 alliance, the purpose of which is simply to consume resources, to keep people poor, so that the entire purpose of the system is to keep the government the party in place.
Right.
So resources are consumed and rationing is justified and all the rest of it because of the war. And that's an excuse. And the whole purpose is just to keep people poor so that they don't have the health and the time and the energy to start to think about how the world could be better than it is.
Yep.
So that's the ultimate situation described in the book: continuous low-level warfare, effectively, and ships and vessels that are larger than any modern warship are built simply to be destroyed in the war. That's the whole purpose of it.
Exactly.
Yes. I'll actually be talking about 1984 in my presentation at ICMI 23. I won't give away any more details, but that is a key point that I'll be discussing.
Sure. Yeah. And knowing you'll definitely tie it into men's issues, because it is. You know, it's definitely, war is a men's issue.
Absolutely. That's right. Exactly. That's right. So tempted to give away more details, but you know what? I won't.
Yeah. All right. Shut up, Robert.
That's right. ICMI 23 is September 30 to October 2nd in Pune, India. I have been advised, it was actually a public post earlier, that seats are now full, actually, and unless there are cancellations, there are no more sales of seats. That's the information I have. So it's great to see that it's great to see they filled it up a couple of months. You know, we're still, I think, 89 days according to the website out. So anyway, so the last point I just wanted to talk about a little bit is what men do. So we've talked about this before. This is a category I actually added on Wiki for Men, and I've actually expanded the category. Originally, the category only applied to men who had done something heroic, but the more I was thinking about it, I thought, really, that term, which has been a hashtag, it's been around for a little while, by the way. I don't claim to have invented that. But it really is about all men doing all sorts of things, all sorts of extraordinary things. I've mentioned a young man by the name of Boylan Slat before, probably just Boyan Slat, sorry. I've probably absolutely butchered the pronunciation of his name. But he is a Dutch inventor, and he's been developing technology to filter plastics out of the ocean. Absolutely extraordinary. We talked about him quite a lot in a previous episode. Just wanted to mention it. Yeah. Because I just think it's so great, and I just think it's so terrible that he's not getting the recognition that he ought to be getting.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So Isaac Newton, when I went to the UK, I got to see his grave there in Westminster Cathedral. Absolutely extraordinary individual. Interestingly enough, too, this is just something that I've that has come up to in my personal life a little bit too recently. Just because somebody is a great mind and just because they have achieved great things doesn't necessarily mean they're a nice person too. So I've got him under What Men Do, but it's also Isaac Newton was. In fact, sometimes maybe that's not. Maybe that's what's necessary. You need a particular type of personality to achieve these things. But Isaac Newton was, of course, an extraordinary mathematician, physicist. Essentially developed calculus simultaneously with at least one other person, Leibniz, I think, from memory.
Yeah, Leibniz. Yeah.
Leibniz, thank you. Since then, calculus has been independently rediscovered many times. I think possibly a few thousand times have been documented, but to have done it first, or at least be one of the first two people. But interestingly enough, he had a habit of not of discovering something, then not publishing it, and then getting really angry at other people who did publish it. So I think that was probably a bit of a character flaw on his part.
Yeah. Well, I mean, nobody's perfect, and
that's right.
Right. Yeah.
That's right. Exactly. Winston Churchill, of course, is another one. What he did was extraordinary, and the times he stood against everybody else. The party wanted to settle with Germany, and find a negotiated solution, and he really pushed on. It's often been said that he's a bit of an asshole, if I could use that terminology. And my response has been, sometimes you need an asshole. So
right, yeah.
Winston Churchill was the man of the hour. He was in the right place at the right time. Who knows what would have happened if somebody else had been in the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in those years? Would they have settled, or who knows what would have happened? Or would somebody else have stepped up the way he did? I don't know. But what we do know is he was the one who was there, and he had the tenacity to insist that the UK fight on. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that about What Men Do. It's a growing category on Wiki for Men, and we've got an extraordinary. Yeah, I just had to look at the number here, and actually, I'm quite surprised at how many I've got in there already. So if you're on Wiki for Men, by all means, look at that category. We've got some really interesting men there. I just wanted to really quickly mention it.
Absolutely.
So, do we have anything else for this season?
Yeah, sure. Well, let's. I know we said we'll talk about Lawrence Southern. We haven't done it for like 2 episodes. All right, so now I don't consider Lawrence Southern to be particularly pleasant. I never was a fan of her, so so I didn't see her original video. I saw Royal Tomasi's commentary on the video. Now I'm not big on Royal Tomasi himself, but I did listen to his commentary. As far as I can tell, he's correct. There's a lot of things I can't yet verify. There's a lot of stuff about him, Lawrence Southern dating Tim Pool now, of all things. And that was something that was brought up. I don't know what to make of that, and frankly, it's a little bit gossipy, so I don't really care about that kind of stuff. But it kind of goes more to the point that that's the sort of personality Lawrence Southern has been all this time. It's not a radical change or anything like that. She's all she and other what some call trad thoughts. I suppose kind of come across as they want to have this conservative, religiously inspired, bake bread for your husband kind of family sort of setup and be the housewife and everything like that. But it's impossible for someone like her to be someone like this, right? And because they're addicted to being an influencer. They have to be like a social like a personality. And looking at Lauren's video through this commentary, it's just like it just seems to me like it's when things don't go her way, she has to play the victim. Nothing is her fault. I think it was pretty appalling that she would kind of agonize over her husband leaving her, but she's the one withholding his son from him and everything. So it's just a lot to dissect, but it's I just figured I'd get it out of the way because I said I'd talk about it, but I was really just pushing it away. It's like it seemed like such a chore, like a bit of housekeeping. So yeah, go ahead.
I did watch the video, although I must admit I did I did fast forward a little bit in the middle where she was actually getting pretty waffly. She was talking about how horrible her life was, and I sort of I did skip a little bit in there.
Yeah,
But
sure.
there's that may seem insensitive, but honestly, I think you tend to be right. I think that one must, if one finds oneself in a situation like that, we've got to ask yourself to what extent was the individual, at fault.
Right.
I'd love to hear her ex-husband's side of things. There are two sides to every story. So I'm certainly not saying she's all wrong, but I really question whether if she's all right about that. So,
Right. Yeah.
but I just to reiterate a point you made. This is something I've thought a bit of too, quite a bit. I've noticed that feminists have started bringing it up too. Actually, that these trad women who are essentially arguing for what they described as a traditional lifestyle, and as I explained in the book, The Victorian Fallacy, it is anything but a traditional lifestyle, right? But what they view as a traditional lifestyle is really at odds with they themselves being prominent figures. If indeed that is the life they want, then they ought not to be, to a large degree, the prominent figures that they are. And there's some inherent self-contradiction in this idea. And that's something for them to resolve. And I'm not in any way endorsing that traditional lifestyle, what they call a traditional lifestyle, by the way. But they're endorsing it. And yet, as you say, not living it.
Exactly. Yeah. It's just trying to have this rose-colored vision of what a traditional good for Western society kind of behavior is, but they just can't make it work because it's a bit unrealistic, and nobody thinks about the mod wife, the non-gynocentric mod wife that we sometimes talk about. It's just people in the relationship going the same path together, but not parasiting off each other. So that's what I've been talking about when it comes to relationships. I've been advocating for that, and if we're more honest about that kind of stuff, maybe being a little bit more of a social media personality. Well, I don't mean social media personality, just someone actually doing some kind of advocacy on the internet. Might be a little bit more feasible.
Yes.
We do it. We're on this show here. We're and we make our relationships work, and
Exactly. And to be clear, a voice for men is not anti-marriage, as a lot of people seem to think. My personal position is that men should be cautious about marriage in Western countries because of the legislative framework which is now in place, which makes marriage so potentially dangerous. So I'm not saying don't marry. I'm saying keep your eyes open and understand the ramifications of your choices, which, by the way, is the same argument I use when a man talks about getting circumcised. If an adult chooses to get circumcised, that's a matter for himself, but I will encourage him to understand the ramifications of his choices. Because I would think the results are very negative, but it's his choice.
Right, exactly. And I don't think there's any moral benefit to it at all. No,
exactly. And so, yes, again, if any men are considering getting circumcised or getting married, understand the ramifications, take a good look around, take a look at the laws in your country and how they are applied.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So one more thing about Lauren Southern. So she in the video, she was like you said, she was kind of being like all you called it waffle-eyed or something. So a lot of belly aching about how life is so hard because she's been this sort of activist, and like the government might be watching her. She's afraid every day or something like that. But so bit of a pseudo stoicism here because she's kind of complaining of it, trying to garner that kind of attention. Whereas, in this episode, we just talked about the SPLC here. And, it's in my mind about, the ramifications about, being associated with, then associated with AVFM and now XY Crew. And, because I'm a member of XY Crew too, right? So, I'm not here to whine about it, and, about the fact that it's on the SPLC, that is, and they might be watching me or something like that. It's on my mind, but just Lauren just can't say fuck them. It's like like some of us do when it comes to this whole the potential ramifications. I mean, it's not about being reckless. It's just being, we know it, but we expect it. We're gonna deal with it as it comes, and in the meantime, just live life true to yourself.
Yep, exactly right.
Exactly. Yeah.
Actions have consequences. I mean, so Lauren Southern has been banned from entry to some countries, the UK. That may well be a life ban. But that actions have consequences. She said certain things which upset the British government, and they are fully entitled to ban anyone they like to a large degree from their own country, other than citizens. And that's the choice. And that maybe that ban is unjust, but nevertheless, the actions have consequences. And she embarked on that course, and just has to accept that's what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yep.
I mean, we've both gone public with our support for men's rights and so forth, and we also accept the consequences of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I mean, I wonder day to day about, the more I do this, the more, am I going to be discovered? What's going to happen about that kind of, but, I decided to not, whine, proclaim helplessness about this kind of stuff. I kind of deal with it as it happens, but try to be true to myself, because I'm now that I've moved back to Florida, I've been developing some friendships here in Florida, good friendly relationships and everything, and yeah, it's on the back of my mind. Are they going to find out that I'm associated with AVFM? Are they going to find out I'm going to be, but it's one of those things. I don't volunteer information, but I'm not going to lie about it either. I'm going to tell the truth if it comes up. So, it's I think about it, but just don't be like Lauren Southern. Just
Exactly.
stop. I'm not going to complain online with waffle eyes and what if they find out somebody give me money
and just say what be prepared to stand by what you believe, and what you say. I mean, I've said many things online, and I am happy to back up these statements and stand by these statements, even if people don't like what I've said. Yeah, and the other good thing about both, for those who don't know, both Vernon and I are out under our real names. Not a lot of MRAs are not. In fact, when I became managing editor at A Voice for Men, I was originally an editor. When I became managing editor, one of the criteria for being managing editor was actually being out under your own name. So, so I obviously was, so I was eligible for that position. But yeah, and one of the great things about it is you can't get doxxed because you're already out there with your own name.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I understand the concerns about some people who don't want to lose their job or something like that.
Yes.
But if you start out with your, I would argue instead, not instead, but, as an alternative, that if you, are true to yourself from the get-go, then you can't have things taken away from you quite as much, because, you're still, I hate to use the term rock bottom, but, it's like you're from the ground zero, and, you can only go up from there, really.
Yes, I take your point. Yes.
Right.
I will say there are, to some extent, it can be the industry you're in too. There are some people who I know in the movement who, because of the particular industry they're in, have to be more cautious than others.
That's true.
In fact, we've had people involved in politics who have made contact, and they have to be very careful. They don't even use aliases; they only talk to us privately. So people have been senior positions in government and so forth, and they'll sometimes they use an alias as well, actually, as well as talking to us privately. And I have a policy too, by the way. If somebody uses an alias, I will always use that when talking to them, even if I know their real name. That way, there's no chance that I slip and use the wrong name. But yeah, so there've been a few cases like that of people who have used aliases and only talked to us privately because they're that worried about being exposed. So
exactly right. Yeah.
Yep, that's a decision each person has to make for themselves. So, do we have anything else for tonight? I think, or today?
I think we're out of things to talk about. There's been no feedback recently. Oh, did you end up seeing that one thing I showed you, that one recent comment about the what was it, voting, mandatory voting? We had a comment on our last video.
Exactly.
Yeah, let me pull it up. Yeah.
Yes, I replied.
You did reply. I didn't see that.
Yeah, I did a couple of hours ago, actually. In my as I was going through cleaning up a few tasks, I went, "Oh yes, I must reply to that." So somebody asked about mandatory voting, which I think I talked about in the last video. So yes, Australia has mandatory voting. However, there are a number of exemptions. One of which is you're physically outside the country on the day. I think we were actually. I think I may have made a comment about how I was not. There was one election I wasn't able to vote at. That situation is a little bit different in that if you're outside the country for too long, you're removed from the roll. And that's what happened to me. I was outside the country for long enough that my name was actually removed from the electoral roll. And thus there was a federal election I wasn't allowed to vote at because I wasn't on the electoral roll. When I returned to Australia later, I simply re-enrolled. Mm-hmm. Yep. The argument being that people who are not in the country obviously aren't subject to the laws of those countries on a day-to-day basis. So if you've gone too long, eventually you lose the right to vote. So better or worse, in contrast, Canada used to have a similar law, but about 5 or 6 years ago they changed it, and now Canadian citizens who are expats are entitled to vote in Canadian elections forever, unless they change the law again, I suppose. So I actually vote in Canadian elections, even though I've been gone to Canada for many years.
Okay, right. And actually, I'm remembering, I hope you still have the time for this, but you were saying something about men being treated a little bit better in movies.
Oh yes, I probably don't have any specific cases I wanted to talk about. I just sort of alluded to that briefly before, but it's just been a sense I'm getting that for a long time there was really every guy you saw in a movie was stupid or was getting that way. Not every guy, but it was a common thing. But I do sense in the last few years that we're seeing this turn around a little bit, and I think it's both men and women are really pushing back against it, actually. So I do believe that we are seeing improvements in society. There's a lot of people in and around our movement that are quite pessimistic. My view is, and I'm not an optimist by nature, I'm really not, but my view is that in the last few years we have seen improvement, that there is a wider recognition of the problem. Another area is just the nature of men being victims of domestic and intimate partner violence. 10 years ago, a lot of people just didn't accept it was true. And now there's a general recognition it's true. They may argue that it's a minority of people, which it isn't. It's about half. In fact, it's a little bit more than half. But there's still a lack of recognition for the nature of reciprocal violence, partner violence. However, that's changing too. We're seeing a lot more. I'm seeing it come up quite a bit. About starting about 2017, I felt that was something that I really needed to publicise a lot, because it absolutely undercuts the feminist notion of intimate partner violence being about patriarchal control over women. When you've got more than half of it being reciprocal. That's something I'm seeing a lot more come up. Still not enough, and it's still only an occasional mention, but I would say in another 5 to 10 years, I expect we'll see that being a pretty regular discussion in the mainstream community.
Yeah.
So there we are. I think things are changing going in the right direction. I wish they hadn't gone in the wrong direction initially, but here we are.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. We're done for another 2 weeks. Talk to you in 2 weeks.
Sounds good. All right. Thanks.
Bye.